Guys, today another Lauma video on my channel with many updates from the first video I made a few days ago. Since then, there have been buffs to her kit, changes to how Nod Krai Mechanics work, and I also personally changed my approach when calculating bloom teams. So I will basically present a completely overhauled estimate in this video here. And basically, in my opinion, Lauma is almost broken. But let's start from the beginning. Lauma is a base 200 elemental mastery in her stats. I'll be completely honest, I did not know about this thing in the slightest before publishing the first video. The reason is that no database reported this to my knowledge, and it was more so something you could specifically see in-game. I think they're doing this because, other than the fact that Lauma is a character that hugely depends on elemental mastery, her main damage ability completely scales off elemental mastery. This means that if she has no base elemental mastery, this ability will deal 0 damage at level 1 before any ascension, and so she needs some base EM. Of course, this base EM could be anything, even 1, so it could be changed a little bit, but since it survived 2 beta updates, one being a hotfix, I think it's here to stay. The impact this has on her kit isn't massive, but it's still noticeable. As it stands, Lauma will probably have one of the highest elemental mastery values in the game when fully built, even higher than Ahida, and this will benefit her damage first and foremost. In fact, the old version of the elemental skill, which when fully stacked can even reach 1300 elemental mastery multiplier, will make her a very strong sub DPS even on teams where Dendro characters don't typically deal a lot of damage through abilities, like Nilu Bloom teams or Double Hydro Hyper Bloom teams. Second thing, the amount she buffs the blooms of the whole team got increased. This comes from her elemental burst, which will increase the bloom damage dealt by the team based on her elemental mastery for a specific amount of instances. So it's basically a quill like what you get from Shen He's quills. The amount got increased in the latest beta, and on top of that, the base 200 elemental mastery has of course also increased the total buff compared to my previous calculations. Now, unfortunately, there has also been a change for the wars. Lauma's first passive, which is instrumental for the support I just talked about because it can make blooms for the team crit, so that's great, might not always apply. The buff is tied to the moon sign Nod Krai Mechanics, which basically depends on how many Nod Krai characters you have on the team. The crit buff to normal bloom damage is when you have one Nod Krai character on the team, so when you have Lauma. If you have a second Nod Krai character on the team, like Aino for example, you will activate a second effect which makes lunar blooms, so not the normal blooms, crit. The description for the moon sign mechanic says that unless stated otherwise, both of the moon sign level effects can coexist. However, for Lauma's passive, it specifies that there is a different effect that can activate depending on the exact moon sign level, so there is a possibility this effect might not apply simultaneously if you have two Nod Krai characters. And this could make sense if when a Lunar Bloom DPS comes out, so maybe Nefer, the focus of the team becomes Lunar Bloom damage and not Bloom. Just to recap on this, Lunar Bloom damage can only be dealt from a single ability in the game right now, which is Lauma's elemental skill. Meanwhile, Dendro cores, even with her on the team, don't deal Lunar Bloom type damage, but just normal damage. So, let's make an hypothesis that when Nefer comes out, her kit will hugely rely on Lunar Bloom damage, just like Lauma's kit does, then in that case, the passive could make sense even if it doesn't apply for normal blooms when two Nod Krai characters are on the team. As it currently stands, however, when Lauma is paired with, I don't know, Aino or Inefa, so on bloom teams or hyper bloom teams, the team will still deal a very important amount of normal bloom damage, and so it's not worth sacrificing the buff for that to get the lunar bloom buff. Of course, it could also be that these buffs can both coexist. I don't know, but for now I stopped calculating Aino teams because of this uncertainty. But I still calculated plenty of other teams, so let's jump to the juicy part. But first, let me remind you that if you enjoy my channel but you haven't subbed yet, please consider doing so because it really makes me notice your support. For the first video I made, I had prepared a lot of calculations, but I used an approach there that I now consider obsolete. Basically, I calculated with the same approach I always use, so basically fixed rotations with abilities usage that is restricted by the total duration of the rotation. To help you visualize this, let's say you're running a 20 seconds long rotation for your team, so a fixed sequence of actions within a 20 second span that you can repeat infinitely in cycles. Then let's say that one of the characters has a 12 seconds cooldown on one of their abilities. You use the ability once, early in the rotation, so you could technically use it again 12 seconds later. However, you can't assume this in a fixed rotations of 20 seconds long, because then you wouldn't be able to use the next ability at the same time in the row to use the first one, and so the rotation is not infinitely loopable. Typically, this is a good structure to estimate the DPS of teams with simple setups that have little variety, like for example hyper carry teams. However, for quick swap teams like Neuvillette, where you can swap characters around however you want, this doesn't make much sense. On these teams you can strategize very freely, so it makes more sense to use every ability on cooldown without thinking of a fixed rotation. So, I changed my approach to analyze a flexible rotation, where, as I just said, you try to use most abilities on cooldown. I still use time limits here, of 60 seconds specifically, because otherwise I couldn't estimate a DPS amount, but at that point it becomes so long that it can't be called a rotation anymore, honestly. In a way, you could say that I'm estimating the DPS throughout a whole abyss chamber, maybe. I haven't done many teams, because honestly, doing a calc with this approach is quite lengthy, and it takes a while, and it's hard to get it right, so I've only done it for a few characters like Kokomi, Xingqiu, that happen to be characters that I think fit perfectly with this type of calculation. Anyway, a worry I've heard from people about Lauma Bloom teams is that you might need much more healing than before on Neuvillette because of how much Lauma buffs the Bloom damage dealt by the team. Since Lauma can make your Bloom hit for more than 50,000, this is a legitimate thing to worry about. In this regard, I'm pretty sure that the crit buffs she gives don't increase the damage you take, because her passive specifically talks about enemies, and so the Blooms can crit on you. Hida's Constellation 2 works the same, so I'm pretty certain about this. Regarding the quill buffs, I'm pretty sure they won't increase the damage you take either, because in order to do that, the burst would have to consume an extra quill for it, which would be stupid. So, I'm pretty sure that the additional Lauma will make no difference in the damage you take. Even still, if for example you want to be safer on some teams like the Kokomi teams, you can simply build her with things that will increase her healing, like a healing bonus circlet, the clam artifact set, or even some HP main stats. The difference in damage is honestly not significant, partially because in the next patch there is a new event weapon that gives a metric ton of elemental mastery, and Kokomi can use that. Anyway, when it comes to Neuvillette Bloom teams, you can use a lot of different characters, like you can replace Xingqiu with Yelan, Kokomi with Barbara, and the difference won't be immense. I just haven't calculated for all of those compositions because again, it's a lengthy process. Just to finish this segment, I want to say that reaching this sort of single target damage for Neuvillette teams is nothing short of absurd. Moving on, the flexible rotation stuff brought massive benefits even to my Hype Bloom calculations, specifically with Cookie. Cookie's Elemental skill, a Constellation 2, has both duration and cooldown of 15 seconds, meaning it's very possible to get full uptime of it if you just swap to her at the right time. Fixed rotations made this impossible, but a more flexible approach produced much better results for me. Lauma is literally pulling miracles out here. If you want to integrate a main DPS into this mix, like Neuvillette, results are still very good. Neuvillette brings the benefit of making the team much better in AoE, because Hype Bloom is first and foremost great in single target. Again, flexible rotations here, although for the most part it's just a standard Neuvillette setup, while keeping in mind the fact that Cookie needs to be refreshed every 15 seconds. As a replacement, in Effa, we can mix Hype Bloom damage with her raw lunar charge attacks is excellent. Overall, I think Lauma is quite busted, honestly. While the DPS numbers aren't anything crazy, I think in context, so in the context of Dendro, this is very impressive. One of the most impressive things I've seen from a new character in Genshin recently, because she's basically revitalizing a whole elemental reaction. And honestly, for teams like Neuvillette, who are just much better in AoE than in single target, these very impressive single target numbers could mean that it will be a very meta team moving forward. And with this, I'm done for today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and also go check the latest video I made on the new Nod Krai changes. Bye bye.